You know they say if you build it, they will come. And aren't you tired of being on the run? I know you're nervous. The call of service has its costs, but it's all worth it. I swear it now, before you now, this won't go down in flames. Not if you build it up. Not if you build it up. Hey, what's up everybody? It's your boy, Wrangle Bangle, back with yet another devlog. Okay, well actually this is the first devlog, but anyway, here's the deal. I'm going to be building a fully simulated ecology in Luanti. Now, what does that even mean, right? Okay, so first of all, Luanti, if you're not aware, is a free as in freedom voxel game engine, which I am going to be using to build this game. As far as what that game is going to look like, first, let's talk about that word ecology, right? What does that even mean? When people talk about ecology in video games, they're usually talking about one of two types. The first is what I'll call performative ecology, right? These are events in the game that are meant to evoke the feeling of life, right? Typically, these are going to mimic a fairly Earth-like ecology. Like, for example, in Minecraft, foxes will hunt down and eat rabbits, just like they do in the wild. But the thing is, they're not doing it because they're hungry, they're doing it just for show, right? So it's a performative ecology in Minecraft. Next up, we have what I'll call fully simmed ecologies. These are things like Conway's Game of Life, or like the Life Engine, which are both fantastic cellular automata that I encourage you to look at and play around with. And I'll put a link in the description. Now, if it were just me building this game, I would probably build pretty much exactly what I just described, right? I would try to build Conway's Game of Life in 3D. And honestly, I think that would be pretty sick. I think that would be a really fun game, and I would be really proud of it. Unfortunately, I can't build this game alone, because the exact second that I made a Reddit post about it, I got an offer from a very serious dev who wants to collab. Now, here's the thing about Conway's Game of Life. Yes, it is a fully living ecosystem, but it's not exactly Earth-like, right? It's Life Gym, but not as we know it. What we decided was, we want to try and build a game that has a fully simulated Earth-like ecology. And then we're going to put some actual gameplay on top of it. If we can pull this off, I think we're going to have something that is as mind-blowing to people today as Minecraft was back in 2009. Okay, so in the rest of this video, I'm going to go over the actual hook and premise for this game. Then I'm going to talk about most of the core technical tools that have to be built before we can start to build the actual gameplay. I'm also going to go over some of the gameplay elements while I'm at it. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I'm building this game, why I think this game is even possible, and how you specifically can help. Let's get started. One of the key challenges with this gameplay concept is the sizing issue. On the one hand, it absolutely has to be finite in size. You see, if the whole ecology isn't being simulated, then it's not an ecological simulation. And since computers only have a finite amount of memory and processing power, that means that we need the entire simulation to be a finite size. This will also help with gameplay though. We kind of want there to be a point where the player reaches the edge of the world and they realize, this is it, man. If I burn this all down, I can't just go walk a couple hundred more blocks and find another one, you know? I need to take care of this place if I want to live here. On the other hand, we want the simulated area to be fairly large. For starters, larger ecologies are more stable, so we'll be able to more easily have a fully functioning and stable ecology. And on the other hand, we don't want the player to feel cramped. There should still be a feeling of wondrous exploration, despite the finite size. So what I've done is, I've come up with a premise that should not only let us handle this issue, but also a whole bunch of other technical and gameplay issues that would otherwise be totally immersion breaking. So basically, this game takes place on an enormous futuristic spaceship. Within that spaceship, there's going to be a bunch of Clark tech, like artificial gravity, for example, so that way we don't have to worry about world wrapping or spinning or anything like that. And it's going to contain a large, living, ecological habitat. Now, while this ship is on its 1,000-year-long journey to wherever, most of the crew members and passengers are actually going to be kept in digital storage. They can either be asleep, or if they want, they can enjoy a fantastic virtual world. That's real life, by the way. You're in that virtual world right now. When you log into the game, you'll be entering the quote-unquote real world. Now, for the most part, thanks to Clark Tech, all of the ship's major systems, like the engine room, are just going to keep humming along without any need for intervention. But within the ecological zone, things are always going to be going wrong because it's a dynamic system, right? So let's say, for example, that there's a weather monitoring station within the ecological zone, just to keep an eye on it. Well, the cables might get chewed by a rat, right? So then somebody has to go out there and fix it. And that is where you are going to come in. That's the game. Go into the ecological zone, fix things up, and then, if you want, you can play around in it like any other game. So with that premise in mind, let's look at some of the core technical systems that are going to have to be built before we can really get around to designing the specific gameplay. Okay, so the first major technical tool that we have to build is the Cellular Automater. This is going to handle about 50% of the simulation load. Specifically, it's going to handle the stationary parts, the blocks, the voxels, the nodes, whatever you want to call them. Dirt, water, things like that. This is going to be what allows us to run all of these crazy simulations we want to have by condensing them all down into a single calculation pass. Because you know what liquid water physics, gaseous diffusion simulations, and Conway's Game of Life all have in common? They can all be simulated by Cellular Automata on a voxel grid. Very broadly, this is how it's going to work. First, we're going to use the Luanti voxel manip API to grab a readout of all the blocks within the simulated area in an orderly fashion. Then we're going to pass that readout to the master calculator. This calculator is then going to apply a rules-based calculation to all of the cells in the readout. Now, this rules readout has to be modular, so that way we can add different sets of rules at different points in development, right? So for example, one dev could be working on the rules for water simulation, while a different dev works on the rules for smoke rise. And then at some point down the line, if devs want to add crazy stuff like scent diffusion or exotic materials, they'll be able to just slap that right in. Now, at this point, I want to give a big shout out to another cat girl. She's actually already started to plan some of the simulation rules. And I believe she's planning to build all of that in Rust, by the way. Now, after all these calculations have been done, it's going to hand those back to the Luanti engine, and it's going to rewrite all of the blocks in the entire simulated area in one pass. Hopefully, by doing this kind of batch processing approach, we're going to be able to run all of these crazy simulations in parallel in real time. And if it can't do it in real time, it'll slow down to a controlled stutter.
See this character? He's too buttery. Let's make him stuttery. Watch this. One click, boom, beautiful, Wallace and Gromit. Okay? 2 clicks, robot chicken. Give him a wave, Jack.
Oh, and then we need to do the same thing for all the mobs. Right. So after we get that first system built especially, and then later the one for the mobs, we're going to be able to get a much better handle on how large of an area we can realistically simulate. And that's going to inform a lot of design decisions going forward. So that's one of the main reasons that it needs to be done first. Oh, and by the way, this thing also needs to be able to handle sub-voxel calculations. People who play Vox Libre are already used to being able to stack snow in layers that are 1/8 of a block tall. So if we can get that same resolution horizontally, it's going to let us have a beautiful simulation, gorgeous terrain, and it's going to set us up for some really zesty gameplay features down the line. Now, in order for this simulation to really feel lifelike, trees and other plants are going to have to grow dynamically. Luckily, there's already a mod for Luanti that does exactly this for trees. I'm really only bringing it up because I wanted to point out that plants are also going to be handled by the Cellular Automater. Thankfully, this particular feature should actually be pretty easy to do. So, in most of these voxel games, as in ours, chopping down trees is a pretty fundamental game mechanic. In older block games, you would pretty much only collect one block at a time. The rest of the blocks would hang in the air indefinitely. This means that if you wanted to gather up the whole tree, you're going to have to start building scaffolding. This can be kind of fun in the mid-game, but in the early game, it can be a big challenge. And in the later game, it can get really tedious to gather up a lot of wood. A lot of block games solve this by having it so that when you chop the base of a tree, all the blocks above it will turn into entities and fall to the ground. That's a pretty good quality of life improvement, but unfortunately, it's not really going to work for our game, for two reasons. Number one, because the ecology needs to be fully simulated, we have to conserve matter. We can't have things turning into entities and then possibly despawning, right? And secondly, with all of these other crazy simulations going on, we kind of have a high bar for player expectations. We don't want there to be a huge mismatch between the polish and functionality on one area of the game and the polish and functionality on another area of the game. So that means that when you chop a tree down in our game, it needs to actually fall over. To make this happen on a technical level, the game needs some way of being able to link up blocks together and then checking periodically to see if those blocks need to be turned into a physics body. After it runs the physics and the object is done moving around, it'll then turn them back into voxels. Now, as much as I think that this key feature of trees being able to fall over is going to really bring the game to life, it is kind of starting to sound like scope creep here, right? So we're going to address that in a moment, but first, I want to talk about some of the other gameplay implications that this technical system could have for us down the line. One of the oldest fantasies that people have in these kinds of games is the ability to design structures like buildings and bridges, and then have those structures fail when it turns out that they aren't properly designed from a structural perspective. And from a technical perspective, the same system that makes trees able to fall over should be able to handle this as well. Basically, it's just a bridge simulator in 3D. But from a game design perspective, we don't necessarily want to force players to have to think about structural integrity all the time, right? So one thing that we can do is introduce some kind of exotic matter. You see, in real life, objects actually have two mass properties. Their inertial mass determines how they behave when they're pushed by other objects, whereas their gravitational mass determines how strongly they're affected by gravity. For all real objects that we know of, those two properties are actually the same. But in our game, they could be different. So if you wanted to be able to add in one block that floats in the air while all the other blocks are affected by gravity, it would be as simple as specifying a block that has arbitrarily large or infinite inertial mass, but zero gravitational mass. And since the game knows that it only needs to check for physics bodies under certain conditions, it won't necessarily require any special simulation rules. Now, let's address the issue of scope creep. Man, you let a player boil water, They want that steam to condense back into rain. You show them steam condensing into rain. Next, they want to see if they can have dynamic wind. You show them dynamic wind. Now they want to see if they can blow a tree over. And if they see a tree getting blown over, now they're going to try to see if they can custom build their own steam engine from scratch using in-world physics. Where does it end, man? Where does it end? The answer is pre-baked assemblies. Pre-baked assemblies are where it ends. Okay, so what is an assembly? Well, basically, an assembly is an arbitrary configuration of blocks that have essentially been glued together. The player will be able to place these blocks in the game world as if they were a single block. Create already has a feature that's pretty similar to this, but ours is going to differ in some key ways. Here's how it'll work. So first, the player is going to go to a special workbench, like the wiring bench, for example. And at that wiring bench, they're going to be able to build an assembly according to special rules. So like at the wiring bench, for example, maybe they're able to place special little 1 pixel wide femto controllers, but they're not going to be able to place water, right? So anyway, once the whole assembly is complete, then there's going to be a stage where it gets baked, right? And they might literally pick up this assembly and go put it in like a circuit oven or something, right? And what the game is going to do then is it's going to create a complete input-output map. So for every possible input into the block, it's going to calculate what the output would be, which is why, we need those construction rules so that it's possible for the game to do that. Because we don't want the game to have to try to figure out what all the possible inputs could be, obviously. But anyway, once that input-output map is constructed, that assembly will never have to be simulated again. This allows us to do some pretty gnarly stuff that we wouldn't really be able to pull off otherwise. Let's say, for example, that we want to be able to support the construction of custom microfluidic circuits. And to be clear, I am not saying that we are going to support that, okay? Just as a hypothetical, let's say we want to let the player do that though. What this system would allow us to do is bake those circuits and have them run realistically without having to have capillary action simulation throughout the rest of the entire game world at all times, right? The capillary action simulator can be restricted only to that assembly and only during the bake time. And from a gameplay perspective, if we are able to nail all the gameplay systems related to this technical system, then the player is really never going to have to request a new block again. If they want to be able to build like an oak chair, they can go to the furniture assembler and literally make their own oak chair. And that is where the scope creep can finally take a break. At least on the technical side. Game design wise, we're actually just getting started. One of the most common complaints in these kinds of games is inventory management. There have been a lot of ideas in the community over the last few years about how to mitigate this. But my approach actually comes from this video by Tantacrul. In this video, Tantacrul talks about how he's modernizing the control scheme to bring Audacity into the 2020s. He spends a lot of time talking about modes. Now, a mode in software is something that changes how your controls work. So for example, if you're using a paint program, the pen tool will draw on the screen when you left click. The eraser tool, on the other hand, will erase what's on the screen when you left click. So those are two different modes. Now, Tantacrul's whole deal with modes is that every single time you have to switch modes, it breaks your workflow, especially if you have to use the mouse to go and find it. And God forbid if you have to open up a menu. So Tantacrul is on a mission to try and collapse the toolbar down into as few modes as possible. Now, that got me thinking. The hotbar in a voxel game like Luanti is essentially a configurable mode menu. So if I can apply Tantacrul's approach, I think I might be able to solve a lot of the issues that people have with inventory management. Let's take a look at a contrived example. So let's say that you're trying to clear a field of grass, but punching out each individual grass block is pretty tedious. So you open your menu, you use the mouse to put a water bucket into your hotbar, you close your menu, you switch to the water bucket, and then you can start pouring water to clear the grass, which you then have to pick back up, by the way. So let's imagine that the player has some kind of push mower, right? Not a gas-powered one, but one of the ones where walking forward is what powers it. So you walk forward, the grass gets cleared, sick, very smooth. And when you're done with it, you just drop it on the ground by double tapping Q. You see, in this game, we have a fully simulated ecology. That means we have to conserve matter. So anytime anything leaves your inventory, it basically just gets placed on the ground. Dropping an item, therefore, is kind of like just letting it go. Effectively, the whole world is now your inventory. When the whole world's your inventory, it solves a lot of the issues that people have. Now, the cool thing about a push mower is that it's actually somewhat primitive. In theory, you could envision a crafting system where the player can smelt down iron, stamp it into some parts, and craft them up into a push mower. Oh, and by the way, we're going to have fully in-world crafting. But wait, I can hear you saying, what I really want is a line tool that lets me place a line of blocks between me and a target point. How am I going to be able to craft something like that without breaking my verisimilitude? That's the neat part. You're not going to craft it. Remember how I said earlier that this game's unique premise was going to give us the ability to have novel gameplay options? One of those options is the Clark Tech checkout system. Remember, the ecological zone isn't just some random stretch of wilderness that you've been dumped in where your only goal is to survive. This takes place on a spaceship. You work here. If a radio tower gets struck by lightning, your employer doesn't expect you to go out to the woods, chop down a bunch of trees, and then craft them into ladders so that you can get up there and fix it. They're just going to give you a jetpack. But even though you don't have to craft it, using the jetpack will still feel earned, because you didn't just get it to goof off with. You, totally need it for work, man. And furthermore, just like a real workplace, all of the Clark Tech tools are going to be inventoried. That means you can only check out a certain number at a time, and to get a different tool, you're going to have to go back to the crew locker and turn in the ones that you checked out earlier. So basically, the Clark Tech is our way of telling the player, listen buddy, why don't you go ahead and pick out whichever aspect of the gameplay you find most tedious. Here's a magic wand that will basically let you bypass that. But the rest of the gameplay, you're going to have to do for real. Now, even then, there are going to be cases where you have to use the GI. So we're also going to do a polishing pass on all the GUIs in the game to make sure that when you have to use a GI, it's as clean and unobtrusive as possible. Okay, so before I get to the roadmap, I'm going to briefly talk about why I'm making this game and why I think it's possible. This might get a little heavy, so feel free to skip if you want. Okay, so I don't want to start throwing a bunch of words around, but if you've seen the news, you know that there is some pretty crazy stuff going on right now. And as somebody who is not currently living in their home country, I spent the last 6 to 9 months glued to my news feed thinking, man, I wish I could do something. So a few months ago, as I was helplessly doom scrolling YouTube, I came across this video essay called Why Mojang Struggles to Design Ecologies. And in this video, our boy Klei Wright talks about why ecology is so important to him, how it could be better implemented in Minecraft, and why that's never going to happen. Towards the end of that video, he says something very interesting. He says, I wish my favorite block game could be more than just a game. And that made me realize that for a lot of people, these block games are already more than just games. They're a part of their lives. In a funny way, it kind of reminded me of Linux. A few months ago, I installed Linux for the first time, and one feature that wasn't in the documentation was calm. I noticed when I was using Linux that I felt calm. I realized that whenever I had used a proprietary operating system before, or really any proprietary software for that matter, I was carrying all of this stress. What if the developer changes a feature in a way that I don't like? What if they lock it behind a paywall, or the project gets abandoned and nobody can ever use it again because it's still under copyright? What if they take the money that I've given them and spend it on something just absolutely horrible? And the worst part is, I never even realized that I had all that stress until it wasn't there anymore. That realization was a pretty good feeling. And if you're already on board the FOSS train, I think you know exactly what that feels like. My goal with this project is to try and give that feeling to as many people as possible. That might not necessarily change any of the stuff that's going on right now, but it will still make the world a better place. And in order for that to happen, this project needs to be so incredibly successful that even Johnny McNormal is going to want to play it. So the question is that even possible? Well, actually, yeah, I think it is.
Why isn't it possible?
Well, actually, sir, I think that it is possible. Oh, carry on then. Okay, so in order to evaluate whether this kind of success is plausible, we first need to evaluate three things: the demand, the technology, and the talent. First, let's look at the demand. One thing that you'll notice about this game outline is that absolutely nothing about it is being pulled from a vacuum. Well, okay, I guess maybe the ship's engines are pulling energy out of a vacuum. But apart from that, every single feature in this game is a direct response to things that I've been hearing people ask about, complain about, or mod in for years. All we're really doing from a marketing perspective is taking all of the things that people have already been clamoring for and putting them all in one place so that they can be polished and cohesive. In theory, attracting players will work out exactly like that baseball movie. If we build it, they will come, even with no marketing on our part whatsoever. And even if they don't, I kind of have a feeling that the people who would be working on this game are the exact sort of people who would also like to play this game. So we're kind of building it for ourselves as well. Next up, the talent. You know, a lot of people would look at Luanti's main menu and say, wow, this looks like a high school project from the 90s. But I've been poking around under the hood. After looking around in the Luanti documentation, forums, and content database, I have come to the conclusion that the Luanti developers and community members are extremely talented from a technical perspective, especially. I think that if there's any community that can pull this off, it's this one. And if we can pull off the technical side, then I think we can leverage support from the wider block game community as well. Okay, so finally we have the technology. 15 years ago, the stuff that I'm talking about now would not have been even remotely possible. The chips were too slow, the algorithms were too inefficient, to the point where, back in 2009, even getting a voxel engine to render was a huge technical achievement. But now, things are different. Back in the day, if you wanted to run Minecraft at all, you needed a gaming computer. These days, I'm using a 5-year-old laptop that I consider to be a potato, and yet it has been able to run not only Minecraft, but every other program that I have thrown at it, especially since I installed Linux. And if that doesn't convince you, consider also that Moore's Law has basically hit a brick wall. Yes, they're still coming out with faster computer chips every year, but the rate at which they're getting faster has massively slowed down. If what I'm talking about isn't possible now, it may never be possible. I kind of have a feeling that it is though, because I've actually seen a lot of the stuff that I've discussed. It's just that it's out there in the wild, dispersed, not collectivized. I don't really do a lot of coding, but I do watch a lot of coding videos. And I tell you guys, I have seen real-time buttery fluid simulation, ray-traced soft body renders, and all kinds of other things that would have been totally impossible 15 years ago, which are now being done by solo hobbyists. I cannot even tell you how many videos I've seen where the dev says, "Hi guys, I'm making my own voxel engine completely from scratch, and by the way, it has this totally insane feature that would have been completely impossible 15 years ago." So in my opinion, the only real obstacle here is the elbow grease. So here's the game plan. First things first, I'm going to take a little bit of a break. I've got some paperwork I need to do, bills I gotta pay, and a little trip out of town as well. But when I get back, I really want to be able to get the ball rolling here. So the very first thing I'm going to need is a team of serious core devs to build out those key technical features that I described earlier. I'm thinking like 5 to 10, but honestly that's just a guess. If you want to be one of those core devs, you can hit me up on Reddit, Discord, or the Luanti forums. I have the same username on all three. Once we have the gang together, we're going to figure out how to coordinate and start handing out roles. Then we move on to phase 2. While the core devs are busy building out these complex technical core tools, I'm going to be engaging with the community to pre-plan the gameplay features. I'm probably going to start with the geology chart, so let's use that as an example. In most voxel games, you can place a sand block. Geologically speaking, this block could be described as fine-grained, mostly silicate composition, 0 moisture level. Sandstone, on the other hand, could be described as continuous grain, also mostly silicate, also 0 moisture level. But what happens if you want to place a block with medium grain size, all silicate, 0 moisture level? Well, in 99.9% of voxel games, there just isn't one. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go head on over to probably the nice name Discord, and I'm going to ask them to pretty please help me design a complete geological chart. So later down the road, if we decide to implement basalt, it's not going to be because we just whimsically woke up one day and thought, hey, wouldn't basalt be a cool block? No. This geological chart is going to perfectly predict every single block that we are ever going to need, at least geologically speaking. And then I'm going to rinse and repeat for all of the other game systems. The crafting, the ecology, the Clark-Tech, everything. Pre-planned, in a list, ready to go. At that point, we're going to be able to start phase 3, modular community implementation. First, I'm going to build a little sample scene that contains just a handful of the most common blocks in the game, plus a couple of mobs, a couple of tools, and maybe a few GUIs or two. I'm going to go out and commission some professional artists to do up that scene with full texturing, full sound design, GUI, everything. They're all going to be totally free to implement whatever kind of style they want. Cartoony, realistic, fantasy, whatever. And then we're going to hold a big community vote. Whichever sample scene wins that vote is going to serve as a permanent style guide for the game going forward. And depending on how the votes shake out, we might have an alternative style guide. After that, I'm going to put every single game feature in a huge tracker. Well, I'll probably break it up, but it's all going to be tracked, right? So every single mob, every single flower, every single block, everything. I'm also going to create some documentation so that anybody can come by and implement even the more complex features using the tools that the core devs have built, hopefully by this point. At that point, anybody is going to be able to swing on by and make a contribution. If Johnny Sunday wants to come on over on a Sunday and spend an entire afternoon detailing the texture for one single little flower, he's going to be able to do that. And it's not going to be a waste of his time, because that flower is going to become a permanent part of the game and bring us that much closer to launch. Finally, it's time for phase 4, the community shipbuilding event. At this point, we're going to have almost all of our technical tools pretty much 100% built up. We're going to have at least half of all the blocks and features implemented. And we're going to have at least some idea of what the final game design is going to look like overall, right? So what we're going to do is, we're going to handcraft the first ship for this game to take place in. I figure, as long as the world has to be a finite size, we might as well handcraft it. That's going to be a huge feature that really sells people. And of course, later down the line, if you want to add like a full world gen, no problem. But we want to get this game launched as soon as possible and as good as possible, right? So we're going to handcraft it. First, we're going to outline the layout of the ship. Then we're going to boot up a server. We're going to have probably about a dozen people come on with world edit tools. And they're going to spend a couple months just having a little world building party, baby. We're going to be able to get some press on and build hype. We're going to be able to use this time to polish off any last features that haven't quite been finished yet. And it's also going to serve as an excellent stress test. If this game simulation can run on a server for months with a dozen people running around using World Edit, then Johnny McNormal should be perfectly able to run it on his computer. And that brings us finally to phase 5. Once we've got that map built, we are going to ship, baby, ship, if you'll excuse the pun. Once we get that first ship into people's hands, they're going to have all the tools that they need to not only play this great game, but also build any other ship they want. They're going to have all the tools to build different layouts, whole different ecologies if they freaking feel like it, whatever they want, man. That's the beautiful thing about FOSS. Once it's available for free, for everyone, forever. FOSS till you die, baby. Right on. Now, I do have a couple ideas about how to make the game even more accessible and reach even more people after we launch. But first, we have to get there. So, if you want to be one of those core devs, go ahead and hit me up like I talked about. For everybody else, keep an ear open. I'll try to start reaching out to people within a few weeks. Wrangle Bangle, out. You know they say it's always crumbling away. All of our achievements scoured by the winds of time. But FOSS is here to stay. And this here is a corny rhyme to remind you to bide your time, 'cause we can always find a way.
Envision a world where we seize our destiny for ourselves and get in the comments!
Get in the comments.